When I was 8 years old, I moved to one of those idyllic suburban streets with tons of young families that ends in a huge cul-de-sac. I spent most of the rest of my childhood in that cul-de-sac, playing foursquare and kickball and rollerblading in circles. Most of the kids I grew up with on the block would say the same thing. But there was one boy, a couple years older than me, who was a little different. He talked differently and behaved differently, and he didn't spend much time outside with the rest of us. I remember asking an adult on the block one day why the boy was going inside after school instead of staying out to play. I don't remember exactly what the adult said, but I do remember the look on their face. It was like, "Ugh, I have no idea how to answer this question, and I really wish you hadn't asked." I distinctly remember being told that the boy had problems and that I should stay away from him. And that was the extent of my education on disability growing up. No one ever talked to me about it in school, not once, ever. So everything I learned about disability, I learned by inference. For example, I inferred from the adult's grimace and from the fact that no one talked about disability that it was something shameful. And I didn't have students with disabilities in my classes, at least not that I was aware of, so I inferred they didn't belong there. I didn't have children with disabilities on my sports teams or in my theater productions or in my dance classes, so I inferred they couldn't participate. And from what I saw, when children with disabilities needed help, that help was provided by adults, so I inferred they couldn't really be friends with other children. In short, I inferred from my life experience that children with disabilities were very different from me, that they weren't really a part of my community, and frankly, I grew up hardly caring about disability at all. To the extent I gave it any thought, I thought disability was sad, definitely a problem, even a little scary. And disability mattered even less to me as a young adult. As a political science and international studies major at one of the most progressive colleges in the country, I took courses in human rights and humanitarianism, political philosophy, identity studies. And I cannot, for the life of me, recall ever learning about disability within any of them. I had one college classmate with a visible physical disability, and I specifically recall thinking to myself what an anomaly she was. So smart for a disabled person. And then I went on to law school, where I learned all kinds of obscure laws that frankly don't matter at all in everyday life. But I never learned about the civil rights legislation at the core of the disability rights movement. I'm not sure I could have if I'd wanted to. Disability was off my radar. And I fear it may have been forever if my daughter Nora hadn't come into my life. When Nora was 9 months old, it became clear she had significant physical and intellectual disabilities. I mourned. I mourned because I believed her disabilities meant her quality of life couldn't be as good as mine, that everything would be somehow worse and harder for her. I mourned because I feared what others would think of her. I mourned because I thought that, like the little boy on my block, she was destined to grow up an outsider. If I'm being honest, I mourned mostly for myself, believing that a child with disabilities like Nora's couldn't bring me the joy I'd hoped to experience in parenthood. Fortunately, it didn't take long for Nora to teach me that everything I'd inferred about disability was wrong, and that I was losing precious time mourning the loss of the child I thought I wanted, instead of reveling in the wonders of the one I was lucky enough to have. Let me catch you up. Nora is neither sad nor a problem, and she certainly isn't scary. She's a little girl. She is capable of learning and of friendship and of recreating, though she'll do all those things differently than I do, which is challenging and can be frustrating for both of us. But really, it's fine, and it can often be joyful and really exciting. Nora is loved, and she feels love. She melts my heart. She infuriates me. She makes me laugh. Just like her little sister, she runs me through the full spectrum of emotions on a daily basis. She's a person. She matters exactly like all people matter. She demands and deserves to be seen and included and supported and accommodated so that she can live her best life. How could I have missed that? How many people had my ableism hurt? How many people had I pitied who I should have gotten to know? How many people had I judged as less than without knowing a single thing about them other than that they had a disability? How many people had I walked past, or worse, turned away from? How many friends had I missed out on? And as these questions swirled inside of me, I realized I had a lot to learn. Years and years and years of catching up to do on what this disability thing is all about. And I also realized that if my daughter's peers were going to know the things I was learning, someone was going to have to teach them, and fast, or else they'd be left to draw the same wrong inferences I drew growing up. And that would be terrible for Nora. And it would be terrible for her peers, too. So, together with my cousin, who at the time was a 5th grade teacher, I founded an organization to do exactly that, to provide mindset training, curriculum, and coaching to teachers so that they can teach their students about disability as diversity, and so that they can facilitate meaningful, equitable inclusion in their schools. The organization is called the Nora Project, named for my daughter, who is now 6 years old. At the outset of my Nora Project journey, I was disappointed to find that despite a great deal of legal progress, many things haven't changed since my years as a student decades ago. For example, it remains the norm to segregate students with intellectual disabilities and autism into separate special education programs. And those programs sometimes exist in different hallways or even different buildings than the rest of the education in the community. Children with complex medical and accessibility needs are often forced to attend schools miles from their neighbors because their local public schools simply aren't equipped to include them. Today, 30 years after the passage of the ADA, most public schools in the United States still are not fully accessible. And even in those cases where students with and without disabilities are taught in the same physical space, there are opportunities to really get to know one another, to forge the kinds of friendships that make lasting impacts. Those opportunities are scarce. And while inclusive public education certainly isn't right for every child, regardless of whether they have a disability, we can do better. It's time for schools to start building more accessible, empathetic, inclusive cultures. Here's how, in 3 manageable steps. First, demystify disability. Teach about disability as you would any form of human diversity. Don't ascribe a positive or negative value to disability. Teach simply that it exists, always has, always will, that most people will experience disability in their lives because disability is part of the human experience. Teach about assistive technology and medical equipment and how it works to empower adaptation. Teach about accessibility and universal design and how everyone benefits when everyone can participate. Teach about the rights and accomplishments of people with disabilities. Read their books, study their art. Talk about the discrimination they face and why it's wrong. Help students understand why language matters, what words are appropriate, how to be allies. Take away the stigma by giving students a language for disability, by naming, identifying, and standing against ableism, and by creating a dignified place for disability studies in every child's education. Number 2, teach friendship skills. Anti-bullying programming has become very popular in American education, and it should be. This programming serves an important purpose, but let's be clear. Not being a bully is not the same as being a good friend. And how to be a good friend is not obvious, particularly to somebody who seems very different from you. Fortunately, there are foundational friendship skills that can be taught and practiced and honed over time, and they can be applied to all your relationships. These skills include understanding the needs of others and anticipating and adapting for those needs. They include empathy, imagining how other people feel, and pro-social behaviors like taking those feelings into account on the playground or when you're making your birthday party invitation list, or even when you're deciding how to phrase a question. Studies show that students who are explicitly taught these skills are not only better friends, but better employees, better teammates, better partners, and happier adults overall. Friendship skills are critical to living in community. Whether to teach them shouldn't be aspirational, schools should approach them with the same rigor they apply to their math and literacy curriculums. Finally, number 3, my favorite, bring kids together and let them really get to know one another. Proximity is only a starting place for changing minds about difference. The work that's required to forge real bonds and deconstruct prejudice is far more complex. A great place to start is curriculum like ours that brings students together to solve a problem, tell a story, or make an impact. We cannot continue to abide systems that keep students with disabilities physically or culturally segregated from their non-disabled peers and expect for them to feel like or become a part of us. We have to transform those old spaces and practices into new ones where students are expected to collaborate, to include, and to believe and behave like everyone belongs. At the Nora Project, we call the values embedded within this system of activities, we call this the Ability Inclusive Mindset, AIM for short. And we strive through our programming to help teachers and ultimately their students think differently about disability, to consider the disabled perspective by talking to the folks in their communities who live it firsthand, and to adopt accessible and inclusive practices, to aim higher. We're only a few years in, but the data suggests we're onto something. In Nora Project Schools, community culture shifts and students see themselves as teammates, responsible for one another's success. This makes classroom management easier because students co-regulate, meaning they help each other, which requires less adult intervention in the classroom. And teachers report a marked reduction in bullying and antisocial behaviors. And minds are changing about disability too. At the end of the 2018-2019 school year, 3 times as many students without disabilities believed they had things in common with their peers with disabilities by the end of the school year. And best of all, 97% of students who identify as disabled reported that the Nora Project made them feel proud of who they are. Let me tell you what I've learned from Nora and the Nora Project and becoming a student of disability. Smart disabled people like my college classmate are not an anomaly. I'm mortified that I even thought that. At this point, I'm so deep into aspiring allyship, I cannot for the life of me understand how the non-disabled majority isn't listening on a large scale to what the disability community has been telling us for decades. I'm going to summarize it here, but I encourage you to listen to the leaders of the movement and hear what they have to say themselves. Many of them have TED Talks of their own that have supported me in my work. But right now, when I'm listening to the community, this is what I hear them saying. We are people, full, complex people. We have rights, legal rights, and innate human rights. Stop treating our access like an afterthought. Our dignity is an object of your benevolence, your kindness toward us as charity. Listen to us, learn about us, include us. Allow us to live the lives we want and are entitled to live. Can't we do that? I'm not trying to say this is easy. Clearly, there's a whole lot of reimagining to do. But we are primed for reimagining right now. The pandemic has changed the way we work, the way we connect with those we love. It's laid bare massive systemic oppression and has kindled within us a desire to build more just, more equitable systems. It's made clear that our decisions impact others, that our personal well-being is tied to the well-being of all of our neighbors in all of their diversity. And as part of this awakening, it's time to unlearn the oppressive cultural narratives we learned by inference. And to do that, we have to center the voices that for too long have been on the margins. Just imagine if disability studies, empathy education, and real, equitable inclusion were ubiquitous in American education. I think the paradigm could shift. The time has come for Nora and everyone else. Thank you.